Hello and welcome to ABP Live. I have with me today Ambassador Atul Keshap. He's the president of the US-India Business Council at the US Chamber of Commerce, and he's a former US diplomat. Welcome to ABP Live, and thank you so much for talking to us.
Great to see you, Nayanima. Happy New Year.
Thank you. Same to you. So you come at a time in India, this is like in this year, this is your first visit. I'm sure you'll be coming several times more, but this is one time when we are looking at the world, which is in a huge crisis. But at least India and US had the trade policy forum, and it seemed that, certain things made progress, certain things did not. But my question to you would be in terms of the fact that it seems that now, under the Biden administration, the focus has shifted majorly on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the IPEF. And although the free trade agreement has been sort of shunted out of the table, how are businesses looking at that?
So there's a tremendous amount of economic convergence going on between the United States and India. The pandemic has been a cruel master. It's taught us that we have to have safe and resilient supply chains, and that frankly, the United States and India have reinforced that we absolutely trust each other, and that our trusted geographies of free people can help set the standards for the world in ways that ensure that we have access to everything we need to lead good lives. So it's the Quad Convergence, it's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, it's the Trade Policy Forum, and much else besides, including the new initiative on critical and emerging technologies. So I see all kinds of positive activity going on.
Okay. Well, the question that comes in everybody's mind is the fact that the present, the Narendra Modi government in this tenure is focusing hugely on signing free trade agreements, right? We've just done that with UAE, with Australia, and more are in the pipeline. So from the US perspective, isn't it the right time to sign the FTA, or you think we can go beyond that?
Well, ours are two very layered and complex democracies. The people have their say. And a trade agreement is a very complex agreement, But I believe that in these very difficult strategic times, the United States and India have a responsibility to expand trade between our two countries. We have a responsibility to expand investment. And while it may take time to get to an FTA, we should make that our goal, and we should work toward it. Things are not getting easier in this world, and we need to be prepared. And we need to do that urgent work for our people.
Mm-hmm. Then also, what about some of the traditional issues, right? When it comes to, for example, the GSP benefits, it seems, again, this time the TPF did not make much progress in that. Some of the Indian exporters, especially from the labor-intensive sector, they talk about those trade benefits that help them, sell their goods in the US markets. How difficult will that be for the Biden administration to restore it back?
GSP has to go through Congress. That is obviously complicated and political, but GSP is also something that countries on the lower end of the exports kind of really need to get into the US market. Honestly, India is a world-class competitor. And if you look at your digital economic companies, your services companies, they're world-class. And India is actually one of the few countries with which the trade flows are very advantageous toward India with regard to the United States. So I don't think this is a very big issue in the bilateral context. Obviously, there are a few exporters here that are very focused on it. But again, it involves politics in the United States, and it affects not just India, but a lot of countries around the world. What I'm trying to do is see the greatest value elements of our economic convergence have the best sets of rules to ensure that the US and India and our companies can frankly play a prime role in all of the really highest value stuff, design, innovation, et cetera. I would add a second layer to that, which is that when you look at American companies and how they're integrating India and producers in India into their supply chains, they are going down into the deepest, most rural areas of India and creating unbelievable wealth by connecting people to the North American supply chain, consumers around the world. They're adding sophistication to the ability of Indian producers to make things that people in America or Europe or Asia want. And they're bringing world-class managerial skill and ethics and talent. And it's right down to the last mile. It's creating a lot of employment in parts of India you would never think would be connected to the global economy. So again, these things are more nuanced than perhaps just one sole issue.
But then, why the IPF? Do you think? And you rightly talked about the trade deficit that that is there, and the fact that the trade deficit is now going to reach about $30 billion. So, do you think the IPF will be able to address that for U.S. exporters?
I think I said this to you in our last conversation. From tiny acorns, mighty oak trees can grow. For the first time in my entire professional career, I was the U.S. envoy to APEC. I was the U.S. ambassador to Sri Lanka and Maldives, U.S. envoy to India. The first time in my career, through all those years of East Asia dialogue, Trilat, Quad, etc., the United States and India find themselves in the same economic and strategic baskets in the Indo-Pacific, the Quad and IPEF. You can't expect it to deliver tomorrow morning. These are complicated things, but we are together, we are talking, we are friends, we have strategic compulsions, we have a shared vision of what we want the world to look like, and frankly, we have shared apprehensions coming out of the pandemic, so let the systems work. Minister Goyal had a great visit to New York. I hosted him there. We had very friendly interaction with our members. He's going to be heavily engaged in bilateral talks with the American side, him and Ambassador Tai and others. Let them do their jobs.
But do you think that the IPF will be able to address some of the concerns that India and US had traditionally as far as trade is concerned, and also the fact that India has said that it is, still analyzing whether to be part of the trade pillar of the IPF. Does that concern you?
Given India's stance in free trade agreements toward the Britain, Canada, Australia, UAE, Israel, European Union, I think India is showing a very encouraging face to the world with regard to trade agreements. The US and India are going to have a vastly complicated trade agreement given the size of our economies, the complexity of our political systems. There are different ways to that goal. You could slice it and do certain discrete things like a digital services agreement. You could do MOUs on all sorts of things discreetly and individually heading toward a macro agreement. The IPEF is a great place to start, right? And it has that Indo-Pacific construct, which shows that we are working together in concert with other countries in a high trust ecosystem to secure the Indo-Pacific and make sure it stays free and open.
One other significant outcome of the TPF this time was the fact that India and US both sides agreed to settle their trade disputes bilaterally rather than dragging it to the WTO. But then there are concerns that this can favor US more than a developing country like India. What do you have to say to that?
I spent 3.5 years helping my ambassador negotiate the nuclear deal. I am certain Indians know how to negotiate, and I am certain they're going to do a very robust job taking care of their interests in dealing with us bilaterally. And I think it's good that we deal with these things bilaterally. That's what friends do. That's what Quad partners do. It's a great way forward.
So that also brings me to the question on the fact that since India-US business and trade ties are so important, why do you think the Biden administration, and you had been part of, the diplomatic corps, the Biden administration is not having an ambassador here? It's been pretty long time. Does that impact businesses?
I refer you to American politics. Look, becoming an ambassador in the United States is a very tough thing, okay? When I got nominated, I had to fill in, no kidding, like 30 or 40 different forms that go exhaustively into my entire background. As soon as that was done and I got through the White House and the State Department vet, the executive branch vet, my name then went to the Congress, where the Senate Foreign Relations Committee had me fill out 50 more forms, a lot of the same information, but they made the point that in balance of powers, they have the right to inspect me and any ambassador ab initio. So I filled out all of those forms. Then you got to go for hearings, and then you got to get through the floor vote onto the full floor, and then you get confirmed by the Senate. It's a serious deal. And, politics being what they are, sometimes these processes take a long time. The President has nominated a great nominee, and I wish him speedy confirmation. It's good to have an ambassador out here, but becoming an ambassador in our system is a balance between two different parts of government, two branches of government. And it's a constitutional function that the Senate takes very seriously. So I wish the president's nominee luck, and I think it'd be great to have him out here.
Ambassador Keshap, I also wanted to ask you about the US-China trade war, right? So while India sees this to be an opportunity where US will look at a China +1 strategy, there are concerns also within the industrial community is the fact that probably the war is only between the governments, and because the American companies are very much operating within China. How serious is that trade war really, and are you really looking at India as a +1?
I would say, from having worked for 2 years in helping lead and steer the East Asia Bureau of the State Department during the pandemic, and then in my time before I retired, that whether a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, there has been rising apprehension in my system about the erosion of our technological edge and the ability of our companies to compete on a fair basis, given what is coming out of the People's Republic of China. And so I think what the US and India want to do is make sure that supply chains are secure and resilient so that free people can prosper, they can lead happy lives. The pandemic was a very cruel master. I was helping lead 14,000 people through a pandemic across 23 embassies. And that was just the overseas frame. Then there was the domestic frame. The amount of stress and strain on the system, one of the things we learned is that we have to have secure and resilient supply chains, and that free countries can trust each other and that they should rely on each other. We have reinforced our trust for India, and India has, I think, reinforced its trust for the United States. We helped each other during the pandemic. The member companies of USIBC sent hundreds of millions of dollars to India in aid to help save Indian lives. India helped send hundreds of millions of dollars of aid, pharmaceuticals and things, to the United States in our hour of need. That's what friends do.
Also, let me ask you one thing. Now that the Quad foreign ministers meeting will soon take place and probably followed by a summit, will the US again try to promote IPF within Quad? How will that work?
So I think the Quad has a lot of work to do. It does many good things, the vaccine initiative, maritime domain awareness. There's efforts to try to spark good joint development projects in areas around the Indo-Pacific. There is certainly ample scope for work on supply chains. There is ample scope for work in many directions, because what I think our four countries are realizing, and I was privileged to help Secretary Blinken convene a meeting of the Quad, the ministerial meeting, within days of him being confirmed by the United States Senate. And President Biden had a summit with the Quad, virtual, still during the pandemic, almost immediately thereafter. So there's strong continuity on the Quad in the recent past, and it's because it has a logic that works. What Abe Shinzo of blessed memory set out over the years makes a lot of sense. That democratic diamond, not working against anyone, but working for human happiness and democratic freedoms.
Okay. Now coming to the fact that the Russia-Ukraine war is going to almost complete a year now, we've seen the kind of steps that have been taken, like the oil price cap. So, how is US viewing that, US companies? And also, if this war stretches on, how much will it impact American businesses and also, to some extent, India-US business ties?
Mr. Putin's war has been disastrous for people all around the world. If you look at food insecurity in Africa and other places, if you look at the spike in prices of oil just as we were coming out of the pandemic, it cut growth rates all around the world. My country lost a certain important element of growth that was projected for this year. 2022 was supposed to have been a breakout year after the pandemic. So this war of Mr. Putin's choosing is a drag chute on the global economy. Poor people have suffered the most. Now, what's interesting is the US and India have worked through all of these issues in a constructive and friendly way. And, I think there are a lot of like-minded people in our system who have engaged in those constructive and respectful conversations. What are we talking about now? Friendshoring. What are we talking about now? Convergence on critical and emerging technologies, co-production of defense materials. All of the vibrations between the US and India are towards strategic and economic
Do you
convergence.
think the war helped in boosting all those?
I think we realize that in turbulent geopolitical times, we got to stick together.
Well, that's interesting. And so my last question to you will be on the fact that, if you sort of look at the 5-year prism, where do you see India-US trade ties going? And also the fact that, a crucial finance budget is coming up for India in the next month. What is it that the US businesses are expecting, especially in the fact that the world is in such a flux?
I'll reverse it and start with the budget. My member companies have found that Minister Sitharaman and her team are very sober, they're very judicious, very prudent, and they have advanced budgets that have really been growth-oriented and have looked at and addressed some of the constraints in the system to open them up and to help India move rapidly toward becoming a 10 and then 20 and then even $30 trillion economy. I was privileged to host Minister Sitharaman in Palo Alto. We had about $2 trillion of investable assets around the table, and they really respected how much she listened and how much she was informed in detail about the issues. And so I think we're very optimistic about the budget. We always offer, on behalf of our companies, respectful, constructive inputs that may be helpful to both countries, but particularly most helpful to India. We want to see India be a $30 trillion economy. We want to see hundreds of millions of Indians live much better lives, develop world lives. We want to see India be a global leader. Our companies are invested in India's success. USIBC works every day to see the US-India corridor grow. I have said in public repeatedly that we ought to have $500 billion in trade. We're at about 160 or 70 billion. It's, growing pretty robustly, especially in the higher end digital innovation and services, but also life sciences, supply chain, e-commerce, manufacturing. India is a highly sophisticated economy. The more you guys open up, the more you're going to realize you compete on a global scale in anything. And I think it's going to shorten your path to becoming a $30 trillion economy. So I see a lot of optimism in how much can happen between us. By 2030, yours could be a $5 trillion or more economy. By 2040, it could be 10 trillion. By 2047, it could be 20 or 30 trillion dollars. And so we have an urgent responsibility to get US-India trade right. And we got to get it done right now because these are dangerous geostrategic times.
Right, but what about, the ease of doing business, something that we constantly hear from American businesses, and also tax reform?
Well, look, any investor, whether it's his or her own money or someone else's, is going to look for ease of doing business, very transparent regulatory practices, predictability in regulation, level playing field, which means I get to compete on par with local champions. And then if there's a dispute, speedy resolution of disputes. This is not rocket science. This is how the Singaporeans have developed their economy into a titan. They study regulatory practices around the world. They figure out which ones are the best. They cobble together something even better, and they build it, and then people flock in. There are more American companies invested in Singapore than in the entire rest of ASEAN. I was responsible for all of the ASEAN countries at the State Department. And you can't imagine how much FDI, American FDI, there is in Singapore. So for India, for Make it India and exporting from India, there's already been some...
What is lacking in India, you think?
Well, there's already been some successes. Absolutely happy companies that are doing really well. But India is still more expensive than China. Logistics costs are very much more than China. And the Gati Shakti and the National Logistics Plan are very good initiatives. The enormous amount of investment in basic infrastructure in India compared to when I was a kid is like magic to behold. I think there's good progress going, but regulatory transparency, coherence, predictability, really important. If I'm going to put in $20 billion on a semiconductor fab, I really want to know what my parameters are for 20 years. I can't have my investment committee agree and say, yep, you can go ahead. And then 6 months into it, all of a sudden, some major parameter shifts. So my plea would be, this is India's golden moment. It is a trusted, stable, massive, multi-layered democracy that is widely admired around the world. But compared to Vietnam or Mexico or Ohio or, China, India still is a little more expensive, and because it's a democracy, a little more complicated. So regulatory coherence, very important, good regulation. I think the Prime Minister's team is doing a wonderful job sort of overseeing how to rationalize business. The draft legislations in Parliament, legislations that have been through on retrospective taxation, all of the enormous number of policy initiatives that are coming out, the world is noticing. This is India's moment. It is India's breakout moment. And if we can just sort of smooth the path a bit, I think you're going to see a lot of investors come in. But India is still not as easy as other places. And that's where if you're a business person and you got to make a profit, you're going to look at other places compared to India.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sure the government is going to take note of that. So that was Ambassador Atul Keshap. He is the president of the US-India Business Council, talking to us about the India-US business ties in such a geopolitical environment. For ABP Live, this is Nayanima Basu.